Well, good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone that's joined today's webinar. As many of you have joined previously on Grazing's Champions of Grazing Innovation series, it's a greatest pleasure to have Charlie Arnott join us this evening or this morning, wherever you are joining us from around the world. We had over 300 registrations for the webinar, and it's fantastic to have you all here. Charlie, welcome to the webinar. You're joining us from Broken Hill at the moment.
Yeah, Cole, I'm here doing a refresher KLR livestock marketing course, and remembering a whole lot of stuff I'd forgotten, to be honest. So it's actually been a really good day one today. Yeah,
fantastic. And I understand there's you've seen traces of rain on your trip overland all the way out there. So it's great to see a bit falling around the place. Look, we'll jump right into it, but before we sort of get off and running, Charlie, I thought it'd be just a few housekeeping matters. If anyone's got any questions at any time, please just click on the little box, the Q&A box, type in your questions, and we'll get to those at the end. If we don't have time for all of those questions, Charlie and I will make ourselves available via email or what have you to get back in touch with you. So don't worry if you don't get all the questions answered. So Charlie, before we jump off, I'll just bring up a few bits of information. Actually, I just jumped into Grazing about an hour before tonight's call. I mentioned that I might get to doing this to you when we spoke earlier on the phone, and I just thought take a look at a bit of a snapshot of some of your grazing over the last sort of 12-18 months or so. I just looked at the financial year 20 sort of snapshot, June 1, 2019 through to end of July this year. And I just thought it would help sort of set the context for what you're going to talk about, as well as for the people joining us today. And I thought it was pretty interesting, actually, because, you know, obviously there's rain and grass around at the moment, but for most of last year, it was fairly skint, very tight, and so I was particularly interested to take a look at this. And so just a few headlines. You had about 350 individual grazers during the period, many of them in a very planned sequence with short grazers with pretty high intensity, with very well managed recovery periods, or deliberately managed recovery periods. I imagine you might talk a little bit about that. It was interesting that there was quite a heavy use of graze planning, both in the growing or supposedly growing season, as well as the dormant or non-growing seasons. And the forecasting was utilised reasonably heavily as well, of which, you know, forecasting different stocking rate scenarios, purchases, sales, etc., and where that was the stocking rate was going to balance with carrying capacity. And ultimately, where that sort of resulted in, when you look at it from an analytical perspective and from the stocking rate to carrying capacity, you did a stellar job, really, the guys on the ground and yourself there, and really holding to your benchmark. So for people that aren't really familiar, there's just a few extra pieces of info on the benchmarking there, which we set up with our customers, but really in between those two red arrows there, you're really holding that incredibly well. Now, it's probably a combination of art and science, but it was quite interesting to sort of see that through such a challenging period. And obviously that big circle represents that forecasting space that's going on at the moment. But I'm not sure if you've got anything to sort of add to that, or you might sort of add some layers as we go through, Charlie, but I thought that was a bit interesting.
Well, thanks, Cole. Look, I guess, you know, it's tools like Grazing that just give land managers a sense of control and able to assess the actuals and see what they've actually been achieving, and line that up and calibrate that with the forecasting that one can do. So, I mean, it's one of many tools that we use, and you know, it's just one of the decision making tools that we use, and it's also, I mean, also, you know, say that these tools don't sort of operate in isolation. You know, you have to get out in the paddock and calibrate, you know, your forecasting, your actuals, and making sure that you're actually you're on track. You know, I'm not a big fan of just relying on technology to work that out. It's a combination of both things, and it also gets you literally out into the paddock and looking at your cattle and understanding their behaviours and understanding the behaviour literally of the grass, because it does behave differently under all sorts of different conditions. You know, after rain, before rain, after an extended period of rain. So yeah, no, look, we're pleased. We did do a lot of destocking in January, just to retain that grass cover.
And all of a sudden, you've got rain coming out your ears and grass getting away on you, and here we are.
Yeah,
now,
it's been an extraordinary year.
Now I've got an incredibly handsome rooster on the screen here now. This is your bit of a segue to get into
my stunt double.
Yeah, that's
stunt
right.
Double there, Cole.
Exactly, to get into a bit of your story, and I'm sure a lot of listeners here would have probably heard you speak before at various conferences or around the traps, etc. But yeah, over to you, Charlie, and I might sort of cut in with an odd question or two, but yeah, love to hear your story.
Okay, look, I'll make it sort of brief. I won't stretch it out too much. So I grew up at Boorowa. You know, we grew up on a conventional farm. When I say conventional, I mean lots of inputs, lots of outputs, sheep, cattle, cropping, a lot of enterprises, and I had a lot of fun. It was great, amazing childhood, and that's what I knew, and that's what, you know, farming was to me. I went to school and university, and that tertiary and secondary education was certainly reflective of that kind of farming in terms of, you know, how we did things. So that's just a picture of me there with my brother and a few other buddies there, and you know, my I guess affiliation with cattle and grass has been a lifelong thing. This is some quick shots of, I guess, dare I say, how we used to farm. I know the picture on the right was a paddock we were getting ready to put some pasture into, but you know, the state of that paddock is not something I'm very proud of. And on the left hand side is a loosened paddock, and we used to pride ourselves on our ability to exclude every other plant from those paddocks except for lucerne, and in doing so I often killed a lot of the lucerne anyway. So, but again, they represent, you know, you can see the bareness between the lucerne plants there on the left. So, you know, we were working to a recipe, and we were relying on a lot of other people to help us make decisions. And when I think about it, what I also really reflect on is that we were focusing on a lot of things that were outside of our control. You know, we were hoping it was going to rain, but I really wasn't thinking about what the rain, how I could capture the rain, and what I could best make use of that rain. So I guess that's a representation of what we did. You know, we ran a lot of sheep, a lot of cattle, as I said, a lot of input, a lot of super, and a lot of chemical in terms of, you know, cropping and animal husbandry as well. We were, you know, vaccinating, drenching, backlining, the whole gambit. And again, you know, when I reflect on that, it was a business that was, you know, as I've said before, it was supporting a lot of other businesses, you know, and it was a business model that was supporting their business models, but it wasn't, as I now really understand it, wasn't necessarily supporting my business model. And then hence there were some changes that I made 15 years ago by going to some grazing for profit was one of the courses I did, and subsequent you know, mentoring and EL, Executive Link support conferences and programs that they put on. Now this one is
a question, Charlie. Like on some of those earlier images there, you're based in, you know, Boorowa, New South Wales, in the upper Lachlan there. Yeah. A lot of or has been a lot of really salt affected country. And did you have a lot of that on your place 15 years ago, and you know, it'd be good to hear what's happened since then too through your grazing.
Yeah, look, definitely. It's been we had a lot of salt scalds, absolutely. That Boorowa was renowned for that, you know, dumping a lot of salt into the Lachlan and heading downstream. So with a combination of grazing management, you know, and also planting trees, there's some established trees there you see in that picture, but we put in a lot new native vegetation that is doing a wonderful job. And in combination of more grass and more trees and a more natural habitat, as it were, of managing that in a particular way, we don't have any salt scores at all. And I'm really proud. I was looking at one of our worst just last week, and there's no sign of it. And that's fascinating to me, because a lot of people sort of write those areas off. So yeah, the management that we put in place over the last 15 years has had an impact on the diversity. So we're looking for a more diverse pasture base. The picture on the right-hand side is actually the same paddock as that picture that Cole had there a few slides ago of that fella walking down that fence line. It's the same paddock, and that's some years later, but it just represents, our focus has changed. We're focusing now on diversity, perennial species in our pastures, and having a ground cover all year round, regardless of our sort of, the stock going in and out of paddocks and our management calendar, as it were. We need to retain that. That's just one of our primary objectives, is if we can retain the ground cover, focus on that. When it does rain, which is the bit that's outside of our control, then when the rain falls, we can do something with it. Now, this is a good example, Cole. This was taken in the end of the first week of January. And
this year,
that was January this year. And, we've retained that ground cover there. And you can see the paddock beyond, up near on the hill there, that's ground cover. That's basically native pasture. The one in the foreground is an improved, as it were, cocksfoot, phalaris and clovers and things. But apart from that vehicle track, we've retained ground cover, and that's, again, our objective. And I think maybe the next one, if it's in there, Cole, I'm not sure if it was in there, represents, the one on the left there, that's the same paddock 6 weeks later. That was in February. So, that, and I don't take as many before and afters as I should, really, to sort of document this, but I'm glad I took that one, because it just represents, that set us up for a really good autumn. We were able to capture that water when it rained, the rain when it fell, and it started falling that first week of February. So that's only after about 3 weeks of after the rain. It's a warm time of year. You're going to get that response generally, but we had the ground cover, and the biology is as important as anything, was still active in that ground. It wasn't getting cooked. It wasn't bare, and the biology was there to be stimulated when it rained to then start. And a lot of that stuff you see there in the foreground of that left-hand picture are annuals. That was an annual response, and that the dry stuff's actually cocksfoot, which got caned. I think I actually lost a fair bit of cocksfoot, but at least it was still doing a job, even though it was dead, in retaining a ground cover. And on the right there's Jim, our overseer. He's digging up a bit of a daikon radish, and that's part of a pasture cropping experiment. That soil that he's got there, we've done a little bit of pasture cropping in other years in this paddock, and I can't tell you how pleased I am with the colour. We call that sort of country sort of pipe clay country, and that's, my sense is, and I haven't got photos before and afters, but my sense is, by, again, and it makes sense, having biology stimulated by a bit of disturbance, putting some other biology like daikon radish and buckwheat and oats in there, I think, I really believe that soil is improving just by looking at the colour. The worms are, easily countable on a shovel, and we're still experimenting with that. And there's a lot of country that we think needs a bit of disturbance with a little bit of a tickle with a bit of cultivation. Just had a
really good question just come in, just sort of on that, Charlie. You're talking about some pasture cropping and experimenting a little bit like that from Audra. Asking about, I guess with a history of cropping on Hannah Minnow as well, fairly intensively at times, and then, how are you deciding sort of which paddocks, you may well improve or keep with your native grasses or start to, do some of those cultivars with?
Yeah, good question. When we stopped, I went cold turkey when I sort of changed my way. I wouldn't recommend that to anyone necessarily. And I had actually had funding in the bank to put some pasture in, and I actually gave the money back and I said, no, I want this to succeed. I didn't want to put fertiliser out to create like MAP and DAP to establish those pastures. So back to your question, Cole, the paddocks we're mainly focusing on with our multi-species pasture cropping are the ones that we just pulled the harvester out of and we left. And they've been, the regeneration and the establishment of the native pasture in there has been incredible. But, that's where we're focusing on that's where we believe we need a bit more diversity, because it came from a monocrop base. The natives came in, plenty of annuals, and now we're getting some perennial introduced species finding their way in there. We're getting species we've never seen before, which is amazing, and we're loving that. But we just still feel we need a bit of a lift, literally some disturbance, just to sort of change that pattern, just to sort of crank it a bit. And then we are actually putting some oats and so on into a few native paddocks that we bought sort of 10, 12 years ago that we feel just need a boost. They're just not performing. Even with grazing, we're not running at like really high stock densities where we're going to get hoof action. So we're thinking, well, I'm happy to burn a bit of diesel and put just a little combine that we drag around behind a tractor just for that little bit of disturbance, just to again to change the pattern and just sort of pivot, as it were. So that combined with grazing on those pastures, and you can see the one on the right there with the radish that was grazed about 6 weeks ago, and we're now waiting for it to warm a little and to recover. So that in itself's been a wonderful experiment. I did see a question down there about fertiliser. We haven't put super out for 15, 16 years, we haven't sown MAP or BAP with anything we put in. This year we used a product called Worm Hit, which is a pelletised worm liquid with these 12 species we put in there. And we use Biodynamic, so we make our own soil preparations, essentially there's a number of them, but essentially with a composted cow manure, and we can put that on as a compost, or we can put that on as a liquid, and that's part of our pasture fertilisation program. But just having cattle and sheep moving in a paddock in the way we do, and the way I'm sure many of your listeners and viewers are, that in itself is a fertility program.
And what sort of we've got a bunch of other questions coming in, and we'll save some to the end, but it's really good to see them coming in there. And if people want to chat amongst themselves on the sidelines, that's entirely possible too. You can just you can chat. That always happens, and it really stimulates some good discussion. In terms of looking back at that grazing data that I pulled earlier, a lot of really short grazers, and I was sort of wondering, besides having a whole different approach, what sort of subdivisions have you done over the time? Have you increased your number of paddocks and as well over the last 15 years, or where has that sort of been sitting?
Well, we've sort of fluctuated. We seem to always be moving fences or pulling them in, putting and rolling them out again. I went pretty hard, and I probably turned a lot of our paddocks into 3 to 4 hectare paddocks, straight up. First thing I did was I put all my mobs together literally when I was halfway through the GFP course. I rang the boys and said, put all those sheep together. Over time, and we were lucky to get some funding. In some ways, it was good if we hadn't got the funding, because we had the money, we just sort of started doing stuff without really fully understanding and having to think a lot about what we were doing, because the government said, here's some money to put some fences up. So, but nonetheless, we made pretty small paddocks. So I'm talking 3 to 4 hectare paddocks. It's probably fair to say we pulled quite a few of them out and made them twice as big. So we might have 6 to 8 hectare paddocks in a lot of our sort of western country, which was more the arable stuff we used to crop. On our eastern side, the paddocks are bigger. They might be anywhere from 8 to 15 hectares, just because we didn't think that we didn't think that the pasture base could support that sort of intensity. We would have been doing, twice daily moves in some of that country if we kept that same size. So we really assessed the paddocks and went, what's a manageable and practical way of dividing those paddocks? Now, having said that, though, some of those bigger paddocks we've left, we're thinking about subdividing them some more now, because we think that the pasture is, somewhat improving, that it probably could handle it. And our skills as managers of grass and managers of livestock in that system are improving as well. So we like to think we're developing. Something I forgot to say there, Kyle, before, my little disclaimer was, I know this is the webinar is the Champions of Grazing Innovation. I don't profess to be a master or a champion. I'm really calling myself a student, and I'm learning every day. And it's these sort of webinars, Kyle, thank you for putting them on, that are so invaluable for everyone in this space. So just that's my little caveat, that get out of jail card. Yeah, so look, as I said, we are learning, we're adapting, and that's, I think, an important thing to mention is, I've been very careful not to just adopt things. You might read a book or see someone, not obviously my neighbours, but other people doing stuff and thinking, oh, that's going to work. In principle, it probably would, but you've got to, I've always said, adapt them to your values, your business structure, your current enterprises, your infrastructure, and your budget. And if we can do that, then we're not depending on someone else's recipe to solve our problems. And I think that's a really, really important thing to note.
And I absolutely agree with all of that. And I think we're all students in this space. And I tell you what, I've been enjoying these webinar series that we've been putting on as much as other people. The amount I've learnt from interacting during the webinars as well as afterwards it's been incredibly valuable. We've got a whole lot of other questions coming on. There's a bunch which are really getting quite specific, so we'll get back to everyone on these. We've got a whole bunch there. But in terms of looking at that, balancing ultimately the dynamic stocking rate to carrying capacity and the challenge of that, and we can see that you've done that incredibly well, really, during incredibly tough time. Where is that sort of sitting now for you in terms of where do you go next? Now we've got the soil profile full, you've got this biology, you've got your treatments down. You're obviously out at KLR refreshing your trade. So you're going to be at the sale yards next week stocking up. Where are things going now? What's the context for now? Yeah. And it's taken a while to get to this position because I know myself from just traveling down the Monero and the tablelands in the last few weeks, there's a lot that are going to do well out of this rain and others that are not so much.
Well, look, it's a good question, Cole. I guess our strategy through winter has been, and from sort of late autumn through to now, has been, we've been essentially topping our paddock. So because we were stepping into winter and it was quite mild, so the grass was still growing. So we were thinking, instead of just doing sort of one selection and taking quite a bit out of the paddocks, we were thinking, well, it's still growing. We want to hit spring with a body of feed that's going to respond quickly and not coming from a short base to sort of, trying to get itself out of the ground. So we were conscious to top our paddocks. We're probably taking a third or a half out, if that. And we were just conscious to make sure we had solar panels still operating through this relatively mild, first part of winter. August, has been a little different. But the thinking there was, knowing we've got a body of feed we're going to at least start spring with. What we need to do now is to, and what again, KLR, and I'm conscious that sort of it's the second half of September at Boorowa, you start getting some movement, some growth, some warmth. So our intention now is to start stocking up, and sort of, because we're under stocked at the moment, one would say, so as to bring our stocking rate up to our close to our carrying capacity at this time of year, so that when we actually hit spring, we're not we don't want the grass to peak too soon, and we want to have enough stock on so we sort of meet that at the same time. So we're actually going to push the growth of the grass out, as it were, so that it peaks a little later into spring. Now, because we sort of don't want to end up with a huge body of feed in early spring, it all go to head, quality potentially drop, and then be trying to buy stock when everyone else is to eat the grass and turn that into cash. So that's our strategy, rightly or wrongly. It's been an unusual winter, so that's what we're doing. So we're also looking at how we can predict the growth we can get with the rainfall that's going to happen, and we've got a few tools we can do that. We can make some predictions. We're even looking at how can we look back in time to previous years' worth of pasture growth, pastures from space and sort of satellite technology, and try and correlate, the rainfall we had at that time of year in that paddock, what sort of response could we assume or estimate we might get at the same time of year this year with a certain amount of rain. And if we can predict that, and we can actually go, well, even if we get a normal year, because it looks like it's going to be a normal summer or even slightly better than normal, then we can start factoring further ahead, forecasting how much growth we're going to get with an average rainfall, say, and then we can start buying with making some assumptions about the feed that's going to be available. And pretty pretty robust assumptions too, is the plan.
And I guess, you benefit from capturing the data. And I know that, we've had discussions about, you've got data in notebooks to grazing charts to, Dick Richardson's program he developed about 7 years ago, which was fantastic. And we do a lot of work with Dick with Maya Grazing, to in Maya Grazing as well. And because the stocking rate, I guess, is the lag indicator of the rainfall and the position. So you've got some pretty powerful data sets in all sort of different parts to sort of cobble together, but you've got data sets, and so how, I guess you're expressing that the value of having that data. And how long did it sort of take for you to realise the power of that sort of data information? Because data is one thing, record keeping is one thing, turning it into something that you can actually forecast is a whole nother kettle of fish. So what was that process like?
Well, I guess, having paper grazing charts was, yes, more a record keeping device, and in some ways not a predictive tool, but more of a forecasting, where I'm going to run my stock, and then you might change that once you put your actuals in. It's a really good way to keep records, and that's how we used it really. And we didn't do too much predicting 15 years ago when we were getting our head around, well, I'm just worried about what my cattle and sheep are doing today. So, it's when we started using Dick's program, his spreadsheet, original spreadsheet, and that turned into an actual grazing program. And then Maya, having that ability to forecast and estimate and run scenarios was wonderful, because, given some history and some assumptions, but even, I've been living there my whole life, you get a pretty good sense of when seasons break. What are your critical dates? You can make some pretty good assumptions that can hold water, and you can make some decisions about. And you always need to get out of jail cards. You always need to have that pressure release valve. We always make sure that we're not hitting our stocking, our carrying capacity. We stay there, and for us, it's more about the trends. If you've got a couple of months where your carrying capacity, or your stocking rate, I should say, is heading towards your carrying capacity, you got to think about, well, now's the time to destock. So, having that data is powerful, and what I need, Cole, as you've sort of, referenced, is I've got it everywhere. I've got it in lots of forms. I need to pull it together and be able to sort of, for my interest and for the interest of others, perhaps, to sort of identify what the outcomes have been with this type of grazing, kilograms per hectare, more and more in a paddock throughout the years. Whether we can work out kilos of beef and wool and so on is a whole other thing. I'm not quite that techie, but if we can find anyone out there who wants to do an intern job on our data, you're most welcome. That one there, Cole, just to explain that one, that for me is important, and it's really stepping just away from the grazing scenario. It's about land management and ecological relationship. We often think we're humans on the top of the there's other ones that are similar about pyramids. We really, and my view is, and my philosophy is, nature is our most valuable business partner, and we often forget that. Nature in the form of grass, of soil, of water, of solar, of mineral, of all those things. And when we consider that it is our most valuable business partner, we treat it with respect and we treat it with care and love, and we have a totally different relationship with all the biology and all of the facets that is nature on your property, that you, within the bounds of your farm, are in control of and influencing, and I dare I say, need to have a relationship with. And we can, I'm not talking about cosmic and all that sort of crazy. I'm just talking about understanding your country, observing it, and responding in a way that is compassionate. And that all might sound all fluffy to people, but you know what? It makes such a big difference when you have a relationship with your animals, not just your animals, but with the birds, with the bloody worms, anything you can think of that is a functioning, part of your business. It really is, So we're part of nature. We're not in the middle of it,
No, I really appreciate you sticking that slide in there today. I saw you talk about that at length out at Broken Hill last year, actually at the Landcare conference. And I thought that was great. Talking of worms, we had a question about worms, Charlie,
Yes.
and it came from Anonymous. There's a few of those on the call tonight. It's a rather popular name. But it was how many
Big family, that Anonymous family.
It is a big family, similar to the Smiths. It was related to, how many years of improved grazing and doing what you're doing really did it take until you started to see the worms come back?
Look, again, it's one of those things that I wish 15 years ago I'd sort of been more conscious of. This is a point in time that I probably should be able to reference going forward, but at the time I was just so enthused and keen to get it underway. It was almost like I didn't care what it used to be. I didn't care what the worm numbers used to be. And this is not a cop out of an answer either. This is just literally what it is. I mean, I didn't actually used to worry about the worms. The worms are just these things in the ground that I really had no appreciation of what their function was, what their role is. But now I'm absolutely fascinated. And my sense is, and again, I wish I had some data around this, we are part of the Land to Market cooperative, and we are getting some monitoring done yearly. But my sense is the logic behind it is because we're building organic matter. I believe we are, and that's a whole other story. But because there's much more, it's healthy biology. There's better water infiltration. There's better aeration that these worms are contributing to. The worm numbers are absolutely increasing because like seeks out like. When it's not so much exponential, but when you're getting when you're cranking up your soil, if that's our focus, then it's amazing what that attracts. It's almost like a vacuum. And when you just give it the opportunity to do what it does best, by literally sometimes just stepping away from it, it's amazing. Example, how many worms turn up? How many species, how many birds start turning up you've never seen before? How many insects turn up? They don't come in plagues anymore. There seems to be a much better balance. So I hope that sort of answered the question.
No, that's great. I mean, something on the worms front. I spend a fair bit of time in the States with my grazing customers all over the place, and speaking to an old fellow in I think it was in northern Oklahoma there, and he's talking about when they were ploughing up some of that prairie country, and they went out the next morning, and the whole field was just silver, and essentially it was just slaughtered worms, basically. Yeah. And you never forgot that day as a young fellow. It was quite an impression on him. Look, we were going to try and keep this brief, and we've already run half an hour, which is wonderful, and everyone stayed on the call. It's actually the numbers have even built in the last 10 minutes or so, which is which is lovely. There are a bunch of other questions here, so if people are willing to stay on for a few more minutes, we might as well just jump in and answer a couple of those, Charlie.
Go for life, Tom.
Yeah. Well, one was a general question. What numbers of sheep could you run per hectare? Now, this isn't a competition down at the pub to see, how far we can do whatever. But in terms of the context that you have in the tablelands or the Western Slopes there, where you are, sort of where you were to where you are now, have you been able to see an increase overall in stocking rate? I mean, these are dynamic things, but yeah.
Well, good question. I mean, we didn't. Look, I'd have to say yes, but that's more anecdotal because we didn't measure stocking rate as much. Like back then, it was more like I just knew how many sheep and cattle I had on. I didn't sort of convert to how many DSCs I had a hectare, or how many, how I had on the whole property. We had more going on. I mean, when I say more now, I'd say certainly consistent through the year. Yes, we fluctuate with the season, but it's interesting when you go and buy a property and you ask the agent, how many sheep can it run? And they tell you got to ask them, well, how many months of the year are they being fed? You really want to know what the pasture base can support, and so we are able to support. I mean, I guess for us, we'd like to think we could sort of maintain in reasonable years 10,000 DSCs. It's probably really what 2 DSCs to the hectare. we're 2,000 hectares. So what's that work out to? Some smarty pants can work that out. But we're at 5,000 acres. So it's not so, we're not looking at so much how many DSCs we can run a hectare. It's more, what's the gross margin on each one of them, and how is each one of those units supporting our business? Again, I just don't have the numbers from previous 15 years ago. My sense is, or what I do know, and this is sort of not stepping away from the DSC thing a little, it's also, to me, it's important about how healthy each one of those DSCs are. If your cost for each one of those DSC is high because you've got to drench them every 3 months, and there's that dependency on external input, say, well, that's the cost you've got to make sure you factor in. You can run, heaps of sheep, but if it's costing you a lot of money to maintain that high stocking rate and that carrying, that stocking rate, then is that really a smart thing?
Yeah, no, that's too true, Charlie. Someone was talking to me the other day about, and we'll get onto it in a minute when we wrap up, about talking about you and your podcast and the regenerative journey stuff and what have you. But in terms of regenerative agriculture, people say, what do you believe? What's my grazing about regenerative agriculture, or whatever? And a mate of mine said the other day, it's really easy to label things, but he says, all I do is make sure that I'm managing profitably and responsibly, and everything sits underneath. So I'm not sure if you've got a general comment about the space of regenerative agriculture and what that means, and is it something that we need to label if people are managing responsibly and profitably?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. It comes up all the time. And it's absolutely valid. I guess there's a definition of regenerative agriculture. Mine is reasonably simple. I keep it quite broad because I think that that's the nature of regenerative agriculture. The beauty of it is it's an all-inclusive, non-prescriptive type of way of farming. And I think some of the benchmarks that people could refer to in terms of how regenerative and it's really about what you're producing. Now, for me, it's about food. Farmers are, apart from those growing wool as well. It's about the food you're growing. Whether it's wheat or it's beef or it's lamb or whatever. Let's talk about the quality of that. And for me, it comes down to nutritional value and quality, and it comes down to how chemical free it is. Because that's a whole other conversation about chemical input into plants and animals and so on, and what that might do to human health. But if you can produce food that is nutritionally dense, meat and plant-based protein and plants, and it is free or not as high in chemical as others, then I think that's a really good benchmark, and that's a really good sign. You guarantee you can go back to that farm, they'll be doing something regenerative, and in doing so, they're most likely building soil carbon. So if someone wants an on-ground reasonably objective way of measurement of success or how regenerative, building soil carbon would be one of them as well. And we're not certified biodynamic or organic. We just, we're more focusing on the output, not the input. No one comes and audits us and goes, now what are you doing or what aren't you doing? We're just saying, our clients tell us what the quality of the food is because they keep buying from us. So for me, that's what regenerative ag is about, is it's quality of food, and it's also quality of life. There's wellness surveys that have been done, and it can be said that people doing these sort of practices in the many different forms are generally of a higher sense of well-being, because they're generally less stressed, they're sort of less inputs generally, and they're not tampering with nature. They don't have to wake up every morning and go to battle with nature, which is what I used to do every morning. I'd be killing a fungus or an insect or an animal or a plant, and that gets pretty tedious after a while.
No, thanks, Charlie. I really appreciate it. And we've got even more questions that have come in that we will respond to between yourself and myself, Charlie. I'll make sure that we answer everyone. So it'd be remiss of me not to let everyone know about the podcast series that you started a couple of months ago. Now, you clearly didn't take your mate Matt Moran's advice of not to start a podcast during COVID like everyone else. You did the complete opposite.
That's right.
And
I did.
I had a bit of a laugh when I saw that on ABC. Yeah. So it's a great series that if people haven't jumped on, just search Spotify and all of that sort of similar stuff, and jump in there. There's interviews with the likes of Jim Gerrish, Lorraine Gordon, Sarah Schmuder. I now know how to pronounce her surname thanks to the interview. I think I got it right.
I didn't.
No, that's right.
I didn't. Joel Salatin, Marie Lowe's. It's some wonderful. And then so just a quick plug there, Cole. So series 2. I suspect it'll be out in the next month. I've got Matt Moran. I've got Rachel Ward, the actress. Charlie Massey, interviewed him the other day. Murray Pryor, some might know, is a pretty new farmer down there at Yass, doing some amazing things. Sarah Wilson, who's written many books, and she's got a really good angle on regenerative agriculture and food. She's the I Quit Sugar lady. Who else? There's many, and really excited just to get out there. And it's a real honour to be able to interview these people, and have them tell their stories that people can listen to. So I'm really having a lot of fun with that, and it seems to be. We've had, I think I checked the other day, we've had probably close to 43,000 downloads in the last 9 weeks since we launched in late May, and I think that feels like a pretty good sort of it's resonating with people. So I'm really excited about it.
So is the reason why you don't regard yourself as a grazing a champion of grazing innovation because you're more one of podcast innovation? Is that right, Charlie? Or
that's it. I'm just changing my focus. It's all about focus, Kyle, and I'm now focusing on the podcast. No, that's it. I'm a student of both. I'm learning a lot, and I'm always, and there's just the amazing stories these people are telling. And we also, another quick plug is we're doing some biodynamic workshops. We've got one at Byron Bay at the end of this month. We've got one at Milton in mid-September, and Boorowa at Hannah where it all started in mid-September too, and that's all on the website that Cole has very kindly put up there for you.
That's fantastic. Well, it's always fun chatting to you, Charlie. No doubt we'll be on the blower again before too long, and there'll be more likely something to talk about on a future webinar series as well. Thanks so much for joining us, and please everyone stay in touch with us with the details here. Get in touch with Charlie, get behind everything he's involved in, and if you'd like to learn a little bit more about Maya Grazing, please just jump online. We run no obligation setups and so forth on a very frequent basis, and going back to Charlie's benchmarking and stocking rate to carrying capacity benchmarks and forecasting, what have you. I ran some stats just a couple of days ago, and we looked at for all the new customers coming on in the last, I think, 3 or 4 months, something like 80% of those had grazing plans and forecasts set up within 2 weeks of joining, and which was a real testament to the innovation that it is out there, and the determination for people not to go through the pain over and over and over again. So if you want to learn more, get in touch with all of us, and stay on after the webinar finishes tonight, and I think there might be a link through to Charlie's website and a bit more info too. Thanks very much, everyone, and good grazing.
Thank you, Maya Grazing, for Cole, for putting it on, and appreciate what you're doing for the farmers of Australia and the world.
Oh, thanks. Pleasure. Thanks, Charlie. Bye.